Good evening. Welcome to Mackintosh in the Chelsea years. By 1913, the mounting tension between the partners resulted in the resignation of Mackintosh from the partnership of Honeyman, Keppie and Mackintosh. In July 1914, the Mackintoshes moved to the fishing village of Warberswick in Suffolk. For many years, Francis Newbery had spent summer holidays at Roof Tree, a semi-detached villa in the main street, as well as renting a converted riverside net shed for use as a studio. The adjoining half of the villa, Millside, was a lodging house at which Newbery was able to arrange accommodation for his friends. Just after the Mackintoshes arrived for the summer break, war broke out, and the decision was made to stay in Warberswick for a full year. Mackintosh was no stranger to the area, having spent shorter periods of time in Norfolk and Suffolk in 1897 and 1905. Drawings survived from the 1897 visit include detailed studies of Blythborough Church. Disappointment of failing to establish his own architectural practice may have contributed to the move and also presented an opportunity for Mackintosh to take a break from architecture and recuperate. Like Newbery, Mackintosh rented a fishing shed by the river as a studio where he produced some of his finest pencil and watercolour paintings of flowers. It may have been that the Mackintosh was preparing the flower drawings for a book to be published in Germany, but the outbreak of the war prevented this. This is a painting of chicory, and the one on the left is willow herb, and the one on the right is fritillaria. This is rose on a checkered ground. This is the only surviving design to have an inscription with the address at Warberswick. It's one of the earliest known designs and shows his evolution into textile designs. By January 1915, Margaret wrote to Anne Geddes, "Already Toshy is quite a different being, and evidently at the end of the war will be quite fit again. And by that time, we hope the war will be over, and then perhaps he can have a hand in rebuilding the beautiful cities which are lost to us." His accent, his persistent visits to the coast to draw flowers, and his recording of the village in his watercolours were all seen as suspicious at the time when the Suffolk coast seemed vulnerable to enemy attack. The discovery in his lodgings of letters from Austria and Germany added to the general hysteria, and it was only after the intervention of several influential friends, including Newbery and Patrick Geddes, that he was released with a recommendation that he move to the capital. Mackintosh went to London to clear his name, and in August, Margaret joined him. There, the couple rented studios at 43A Glebe Place and took lodgings nearby. This is an image inside the studio at Glebe Place, which I took in 2009 as part of the centenary for the Glasgow School of Art. The studio now doesn't exist, and there's no historic records or images that we know of the actual studio. Despite having little money, they ate most evenings at the Blue Cockatoo on Cheney Walk. For the Mackintoshes, Chelsea was, in a sense, almost a home from home. A sort of bohemian quarter had long been attractive to artists and musicians. This is a painting by Christopher Sanders of the Blue Cockatoo, which doesn't exist anymore. Prominent in the tight-knit artistic community was the Scottish colourist J.D. Ferguson, who had known Mackintosh in Glasgow. Ferguson's partner, the dancer Margaret Morris, recorded, "One day the bell rang. I went down, opened the door and found old Toshy with a delightful happy smile, holding a small flower pot with two slim intertwined twigs, two leaves near the bottom and two more at the top. He laughed and said, 'I saw this in a barrow and had to bring it to you. It's so like you.'" Another Glasgow connection was the sculptor Francis Derwent Wood, who had taught at the Glasgow School of Art and given the city some of its liveliest and most innovative sculptures in association with James Salmon. Augustus John had known the McNairs in Liverpool, now came into contact with Mackintosh, whose friendship I enjoyed in Chelsea. Another who became an engaging companion was the draftsman and theatrical designer Randall Schwab. Also around was the musician Eugene Goossens and the composer Arnold Bax. Here, Mackintosh attempted to restart his architectural career, but the outbreak of the First World War made this very difficult. The war also had severed all ties the couple had established with mainland Europe and became a barrier to the critical acclaim they had enjoyed prior to its start, most notably in Austria. The Scottish theorist and town planner Patrick Geddes, who had been a friend of the Mackintoshes in Glasgow, gave him some employment as a draftsman in connection with a summer school he was running in London in 1915. It may have been for this or for Geddes' town planning work in India that Mackintosh made two designs for buildings in an arcaded street. Despite some superficial oriental details, the elevations are essentially classical, with regular repeating bays, and they may represent an attempt on Mackintosh's part to come to terms with the prevailing fashion for classicism. It was almost certainly through Geddes that he received what he described in the letter to his old patron, William Davidson, as a tentative offer from the Indian government to go out there for some 6 months starting in October to do some work in reconstruction schemes. They want me to do the architecture. There is no evidence that anything came of this proposal. Had it gone ahead, it might have provided the stimulus and the opportunity for Mackintosh to move forward in a new direction. Among the drawings Mackintosh made for Geddes was this ambitious design for a war memorial. It's quite impressive. Mackintosh made efforts to extend his income producing designs for printed textiles for sale to several manufacturers who were interested in modern design. Between 1915 and 1923, he produced over 120 different designs in this new medium, ranging from patterns based on stylized flowers and natural forms to more abstract motifs, vibrant and undulating designs that look forward to Art Deco. There is record of some of the money Mackintosh received in connection with some of the sales. He sold 6 designs to Mr. Sefton for £57. This is here's a few of the styles: tulip and lattice and stylized tulips. And this is blue and pink tobacco flowers. He also started work on a series of finished watercolors, which could be sent to various exhibiting societies in the hope of making sales. This is white tulips. This is yellow tulips, which is probably one of the later paintings made just before the Mackintoshes left London for France in 1923. Mackintosh chose to send it to Chicago for the 4th International Exhibition of Watercolor Paintings in 1924. Its setting is unique, showing in the background a wall of his Glebe Place studio. The painting sold in 2012 in Edinburgh for £157,000, including commission. Within this difficult economic climate, Mackintosh's fortunes improved in 1916 when he was commissioned to redesign the home of engineer W.J. Bassett-Lowke at 78 Derngate, Northampton. He was Mackintosh's most important patron from his Chelsea years, commissioning and remodeling the furnishing of the principal interiors at his home. Mackintosh also created designs for the furnishing and decoration of his holiday home at Candida Cottage near Northampton, and a series of advertising labels and greeting card designs. The guest bedroom decor that Bassett-Lowke had commissioned for his Northampton home was so striking that his wife, Florence, worried it might disturb their visitors' sleep. The guest in question, George Bernard Shaw, is said to have replied that she need not worry. He always slept with his eyes shut. Mackintosh's bold geometric designs for the interiors and the very modern rear elevation were a confident expression of the architect working at the height of his powers again and experimenting with new decorative forms. Here is a Christmas card that he designed for Bassett Loke, which again brings in everything that Bassett Loke like, with trains and sailing and sort of very Art Deco in its style. In the autumn of 1918, as the First World War approached its end, a far more deadly killer was sweeping the globe, the Spanish influenza. Although recognised as contagious, it was not mentioned in Parliament until October 1918, and there was no strategy for tackling it. Back then, there was no National Health Service, so the response was decentralised and uncoordinated. By the end of the summer 1999, when the pandemic had subsided, a quarter of the British population had been infected and 250,000 people in Britain had died. We know it infected half of London, but we have no information on how the Mackintoshes coped with the pandemic. The Mackintoshes were friends with the renowned society photographer E.O. Hoppe and his wife. This is a portrait of Mackintosh by Hoppe, and this is a self-portrait of Hoppe on the right. Hoppe was having a modest extension to his weekend cottage at East Grinstead, and these alterations and additions were designed by Mackintosh. The scheme was not carried out, but there is evidence that some unspecified work was done for Hoppe by Mackintosh, to Mackintosh's designs. Both couples were members of the Plough, a club founded in 1917 for the purpose of stimulating interest in good art of an unconventional kind. Mackintosh, who was a committee member, along with, among others, the sculptor Jacob Epstein and the poet Lawrence Binyon. A distant member of the Plough was William Davidson in Glasgow. By 1919, with the war over, building became more feasible, and a number of clients emerged from Mackintosh's artistic circle in Chelsea. At the start of 1920, things suddenly seemed to look up. Mackintosh received several commissions for buildings on the site of Old Cheney House and its garden, very close to his Chelsea studio. And there was a real prospect of doing significant architectural work again. The various projects are documented in a large number of surviving drawings and in a business diary kept that year, which seems to indicate a renewed sense of purpose. A promising commission was from the Arts League of Service to build a large block of studios and studio flats for the south side of Glebe Place, facing Upper Cheney Row. Ferguson and Margaret Morris were prime movers in the Arts League of Service. When the project was stalled, it was, according to Margaret Morris, because the planning authority wanted a few Greek columns or swags of fruit or flowers, which Mackintosh refused to supply, although he touched on another cause when he noted laconically, "It was left to me to proceed with the plans for Minister of Housing and get Grant if possible." Another ongoing project was an intended theatre for the dancer and dance teacher Margaret Morris. A design for a theatre was possibly also intended for part of the site. Of all the new buildings in Chelsea, the ones that Mackintosh cannot have failed to notice, and they do seem to have had a considerable influence on his designs for Glebe Place, were those built in Cheney Walk by C.R. Ashby, the arts and craft designer, who, like Mackintosh, was known and admired in Vienna. Between 1893 and 1930, Ashby, a long-standing Chelsea resident, had built 7 houses facing the Thames along Cheney Walk. Sadly, only 2 of these survive today. As Ashby's biographer Alan Crawford has written, he thought in streetscape terms, creating a medley of buildings next door to each other, some in a bare arts and crafts style, others neo-Georgian, also various in form and more modest in detail. Anyone who looked carefully would see a difference between inside and out, a playing with appearance, such as informs some of the best of Mackintosh's Glasgow's buildings. The Mackintoshes would have passed some of these buildings every day as they went to dinner at the Blue Cockatoo restaurant, next to Ashby's own house, 37 Cheney Walk, better known as the Magpie and Stump. In his several designs for the group of 3 buildings he proposed in Glebe Place, Mackintosh demonstrated something of Ashby's ability to create both unity and variety in terms of picturesque streetscape. And he was happy to play with several styles, including Tudor half timber in the garden elevation of Harold Squire's studio. 49 Gleam Place was originally designed by CRM for the painter Harold Squire as one of 3 studio commissions in Glebe Place in 1920. Unfortunately, 48 for Arthur Blunt, which is the artist and decorator, and 50 for Francis Derwent Wood did not go ahead. The site had been the garden of the old Cheney house. This is a detail at the rear of showing the three studios at Glebe Place. Harold Squire was born in Chile in 1891. He came to England at the age of 10. Squire was a member of the Council of the Arts League of Service, and it is through this organisation that he met Mackintosh. This is a painting of clay pits in Dorset in 1924 by Harold Squire. The design for 49 Glebe Place seems to have gone through 3 stages. The first, which probably belongs to January and February 1920, was for an expensive studio house on 2 and 3 stories with elevations like those in the 3 Chelsea studios that you can see here. So the middle section is 49 Glebe Place. The second scheme, which ran from March to the middle of June, is more fully developed in the surviving drawings. He moved the studio block forward to the street and put the domestic offices on the ground floor. The street front was not greatly altered, and a big studio window was framed by a stepped brick architrave, which hovers somewhere between Vienna, Holland, and the later stages of the English arts and crafts movement. It appears that Harold Squire's sister Evelyn Claude was paying for Glebe Place and that her purse was not as deep as Squire or Mackintosh had assumed. On the 12th of June, Squire asked Mackintosh to redesign the scheme with a single-story studio. At this, the 3rd stage, Mackintosh's nerve or possibly his patience failed. He set the studio back again from the street, giving it the form of a big shed with its north window reaching down to the ground, and put in front of it a strangely blank single-story building containing a sitting room and kitchen. This design was, with the addition of the 2 bedrooms perched on the flat roof, was built and probably completed in early 1921. In June 1935, Augustus John borrowed Vanessa Bell's studio. In November that year, he had moved into Euphemie Lamb's artist, model, and wife of Henry Lamb's house at 49 Glebe Place, later owned by Gerald Reitlinger, who was an art historian, and then by Edward le Bas. There's no indication when John gave up the studio, but in March 1938, he rented the cottage in Primrose, Codrington's estate, famous for its garden at Park House in South Kensington. Richard Burrows' uncle, the artist Edward le Bas, lived here from 1948 to 1966. This is a portrait of Edward by Cecil Beaton in 1922, which is in the National Portrait Gallery. This interior by Edward le Bas is in the Tate. It was painted in 1951, and it was actually painted in the artist studio at 49 Glebe Place in Chelsea. As well as being an avid collector of contemporary art at the turn of the 20th century, Edward le Bas was one of Britain's most talented painters who, despite being an elected member of the Royal Academy and awarded a CBE, has been slightly failed by the history books. Le Bas' style owes much to the French tradition, post-impressionism in particular, and to the work of his great friend Duncan Grant and the Bloomsbury Group, a circle of British artists with whom he was associated. As a collector, le Bas amassed a hoard of important works. I'll now pass you over to Richard, who will tell you more about the house and its wonderful treasures. Thank you. You okay there, Richard?
Yep, I'm ready. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My mother, Molly le Bas, which is photographed here by Cecil Beaton, she was a sculptor, found the house in 1947 for her brother, Edward le Bas. Molly had exhibited at the Royal Academy previous years as sculptress. Stuart, I think you're going to show some of her work here. There we go. That's a particular sculpture I like, which is in the studio now. She was also sculpted herself by Whitney Smith. Here we are. That is the sculptor, as you can see, in the 20s, 1928. He was a past president of the Royal Academy. Edward le Bas, self-portrait over the door. Here we are, with his old friend Augustus John. He was on the hanging committee at the Royal Academy with Augustus John and various other painters. Students and painters found it was preferable to show their work after lunch, when the committee had had an extremely good lunch and were much more likely to vote their paintings through. Edward le Bas, having had a successful father during his life, was in a position to collect paintings. At Cambridge, he trained as an architect, so formed an appreciation of beautiful things. He was a friend of Cecil Beaton at Cambridge, as you saw the picture. During his lifetime, he collected 350 paintings, of which 332 were shown in a collection called the Painters Collection in 1963 at the Royal Academy. There are one or two paintings Stuart has kindly got together. You can see here, this is a Picasso, which was in his collection. He had a wonderful, this one is a Matisse, which you'll see again in a painting Edward did of my mother with the Matisse in the background. He had a Pissarro, a Bonnard. This is rather a lovely painting. In fact, I thought it was one of Bonnard's girlfriends. In fact, it was Bonnard's mistress, who sadly, she told him that she would like to marry him. So he went back to tell his wife that things were over and he was going to marry his mistress, to which she replied, certainly not, you're not going to do that. He went and told the mistress, who sadly, this lovely girl, shot herself. So that was the end of that affair. Anyway, we left that one to the Tate. This is a lovely painting by Duncan Grant, done in about 1904, I think it is. And I'm particularly happy to have that back in the collection because it's an extremely early and very good Duncan Grant. So there we are. So he had a number of paintings, a lot of paintings of the Bloomsbury Group, mainly Ethel Walker and Duncan Grant. When Edward was at Cambridge, he fell in love with an older Japanese concert pianist. Sadly, my grandfather, Edward le Bas Sr., was not enamored with this idea, which caused a rift in the family. Edward and his partner left and lived in Ireland for a number of years. And sadly, when Edward was 27, she died of cancer. And after that, he never married, but had friends of both sexes. He traveled widely in France, Italy, Morocco, and painted 400 paintings, which is about normal for an artist. Just to give you an idea, there was a wonderful book produced called The World of Art or something like that. And it said in that book that Renoir, during his lifetime, painted 400 paintings, 4,000 of which are now hanging in America. So do be very careful when you're buying Renoirs or other paintings to make sure that they are real. We have one or two fakes in our collection as well. Edward was very talented, hopelessly vague, once leaving the taps running upstairs and going away for 2 months. The water ran down all the walls of the studio, luckily behind all the paintings, causing very little damage, in fact, nothing to the paintings, as the house was only insured and his collection was only insured under household effects for about £2,000. He disliked the world of commerce, which my family was obviously involved in, but attended our family annual general meeting after much persuasion from my father, who was chairman of the Le Bas Investment Trust at the time. However, on his way to our meetings, he would stop at the Ritz and get his strength up. Here's that wonderful room where everybody has tea. It's an enormous expense, but it's sold out for years ahead. He would have a couple of cocktails there, and he would sit in the meeting, keeping very quiet. But on one particular day, when my father had explained we were having great difficulties with strikes, trade unions, bankers, etc., Edward, to our amazement, decided to speak. And he said to my father, "Brockus, wouldn't it be sensible for you to sell the businesses and buy a number of Picassos, as they're very pleasant, they don't argue, and I'm told they could be quite good investments, whatever that might be." My father, being a retired general, replied that as a family, we will continue to toil, and as Churchill said, we will never give in. He then inquired as to whether Edward had possibly overtrained at the Ritz. But of course, his suggestions would have given the family an enormous amount of pleasure and no doubt an extremely good investment. Edward was approached by his father to visit the head office of Le Bas Investment Trust, which in those days was in the depths of Millwall. Sadly, we were bombed out of there. He finally succumbed to pay a visit, provided he could drive his new Bentley sports car behind the family's chauffeur-driven road, very grand in those days. On the journey, Edward's concentration was somewhat distracted by a girl of immense beauty on the sidewalk, just as the rolls braked to avoid a drunk who wandered into the road. Edward jammed the family rolls, an argument ensued, which was the end of Edward le Bas Jr.'s business career. Just reverting to Edward, when he was 60, he suggested that he and I should have a joint party at Glebe Place. You can now see the studio with a Rennie Mackintosh chair going up the steps there, which sadly is only a copy of the original one. And there's another one up in the top there, I see as well. So we were told to ask about 30, 35 friends each. One of the artists, who shall be nameless, a friend of Edward's, appeared with an ex-girlfriend of mine, who was quite frankly, was quite young enough to be either his daughter or his granddaughter. The painter said to me, "What are you doing here?" To which I replied that Edward was my uncle, etc. During the evening, my father's butler was behind the bar serving the drinks. He came over to inform Edward that one of the painters had fallen asleep in front of the bar, which made serving drinks rather a problem. And Edward inquired as to who he was and said, "He always goes first. Could you roll him under the bar and then he'll join the party later," which he duly did. As the party progressed, the Italian quartet from the Petit Club Français, which was a little restaurant off St. James's Street, broke into a Spanish dance with maracas rattling, and two rather beautiful girls with a soupçon of Spanish blood started dancing together with great rhythm on the floor. Augustus was standing next door to Duncan Grant and me, and was heard to remark on the beauty of the cheekbones of the slightly taller girl, to which Duncan, in his very quiet voice, replied, "Augustus, surely you haven't forgotten our holiday in Toledo, when you spent many a night in absentia and professed to yet again have fallen in love." He was a great romantic, Augustus, but anyway, there we are. She was a very pretty girl. Next, Gerald Kelly was a great friend to Edward and wrote to him, "O King of Colour," because he loved the colours Edward painted. And he said to Edward, after 22 years on the hanging committee, which I know you've enjoyed, might you consider putting your name forward as a possible successor to me as president of the Royal Academy? To which Edward replied, there was no job he was less capable of doing, since he was terrified of public speaking, was sure he would overindulge before dinner and ruin the evening for everyone. He preferred to live an insular life, painting and seeing his friends. This painting of the Burmese dancer, incidentally, I was very lucky in the slump of the 70s to be rung by a friend to say it was coming up at Sotheby's. And I said, yeah, I hadn't got any money like everybody else. We were all bust at that time. And he said, when you see the painting, you will buy it. And we did, which was rather nice. And we still have that in the country. Now, just going on, one evening, Edward asked Duncan, Lindy Guinness, his muse, and me to join him for dinner. And during the evening, as Duncan enjoyed some very good wine, which Edward had, and extremely good food, he suddenly announced he would be leaving, as Edward le Bas and I spent the whole evening trying to pick up his girlfriend. This was Lindy Guinness, who herself was a very fine, here we are, her painting in Ireland. She sadly died just recently of cancer, which was sad. Lindy was absolutely furious, and I was asked to take Duncan immediately home, so I caught a taxi. I got him as far as his house just near Buckingham Palace, where he professed complete society. I held onto his arm as we staggered up the steps, opened the front door for him. He fell flat on his face, so I must be one of the few people who've had to put Duncan Grant in that time to bed. As time rolled on, Edward became a little forgetful. One time he rang me up just after I'd married and asked if I would come round to meet some charming Americans who he'd met the previous night. They were coming for a drink, and he was told they were quite important, but he couldn't remember who they were. I was told by Edward the housekeeper would let them in. I should greet them in the middle of the studio, and then Edward would come down the stairs into the studio. As I stood there, the housekeeper opened the front door, and a man rather larger than life appeared into the studio, introduced himself and said, good evening, my name is Cubby Broccoli and I make films. Here we are, there's a picture of him. So I said, Cubby, very nice to meet you. Edward will join us in a minute. And Edward appeared at the top of the stairs. And I said, Edward, this is Cubby Broccoli, who I believe. Of course I know him, said Edward. I met him last night for a drink. Cubby, how very nice to see you again. Anyway, the job was done, and the next day a taxi arrived at my house in North London, containing a very nice Edward le Bas, which you can see here, which is one of my favorite paintings by him. And I think it's very good quality. Edward used the painting for painting his, used the studio for painting his still lifes and occasionally models. And one day he was in the middle of painting a very attractive young lady with nothing on, lying on the blue velvet sofa, which you've seen in the middle of the studio, when his coal delivery arrived with his Mr. Higgins type delivery man. Edward was in a bit of a fluster about this, asked if the delivery man could deliver the next day, to which he was told, you either get it today or you'll get it after Christmas because I'm extremely busy. The coal was kept in the yard behind the studio. You had to walk through the studio to deliver it. Anyway, Mr. Higgins replied it was now or never, as he was busy. So Edward returned to the model, said to her, do you mind, and covered her up with a blanket, asked the coalman to deliver the coal to the store at the back. Coleman walked into the studio and noticing a young lady clearly in a state of undress, he dumped the coal in the middle of the studio, a large sack of coal, furiously announced he'd never before been invited to enter a house where some immoral activity was going on, and what would anybody think of him or his wife, etc. From then on, we had to change the house over to gas. As you can see, we now have a gas fire in the studio. Edward regularly took Vanessa Bell on the left and Duncan on holiday, and hence he was a very happy owner of many of their paintings because they never had any money. So at the end of each holiday, they gave him a painting. And so he had 20 or 30 paintings by each of them, which was lovely. On one of these holidays, they crossed in Edward's convertible Bentley, which was the most beautiful car, to Le Havre. And they went to a little village where there was the most marvelous restaurant, which served, it was noted for serving chicken in a mushroom white wine sauce with lashings of local white wine. And I have been there and I can confirm it was wonderful. At the end of rather a long lunch, they climbed into the car, started the engine, put it into gear, but it wouldn't move. So Edward persuaded the restaurant owner to call Bentley's in England, who sent an engineer in a couple of days over to discover that the two back wheels of his Bentley car had been stolen. So they merely stayed in the local village, took some accommodation, and went round painting in the local village. Here you can see the restaurant in the background, which I have been to, the wonderful colours of it, and a large car on the right, which actually isn't Edward's car. Edward asked me to be his trustee and executor, and then sadly died a few weeks later. And many of his paintings had to be sold to pay for death duties. However, he left many paintings to museum, the most remarkable one being the Bonnard, the Bol du Lait. Sorry, this isn't the one, this is another Bonnard sea scene, but it does, you have seen the Bonnard of the Bol du Lait with the young mistress of his in the background, but this was a lovely still life. I'm afraid they all had to go. The remainder of the collection was left to 5 nephews and nieces and was split into 5 different collections. The next painting is of my mother by Edward le Bas when he lived, I think, in Montague Square. And above it, you can see that wonderful Matisse, which sadly, again, we had to sell for a very good price in Geneva. My wife, Angela, after Edward died, my mother came to live in the studio. And she said to me at the time, I shall only be here for a couple or maybe 3 years, so don't worry about that. Her lease was quite a short one. I think it was 3 or 4 years at the time. And at the time, the church had run into problems with prospecting in property in the 70s at the wrong time and needed to raise a lot of money. And I did happen to know they were in trouble. So we got in touch with their agents and we were luckily able to buy the freehold of the house many, many years ago in the 60s, or yes, around the 60s. But my mother, luckily, as far as I was concerned, she said she'd only be here 3 years. She actually lived here 35 years and died aged 93 in 1997 when she moved to the better world. The house was slowly falling into disrepair. Whenever I'd said to her, I think we ought to rewire it or replumb it, she said, darling, I shan't be here very long and then you can do everything. So we decided when she did move on that it was time really to increase the size of the house, as it only really had the main bedroom, which was where Edward lived and where my mother lived for so long. And so we increased it to 6 double bedrooms by putting in a basement. As you can see in this rather good drawing, you can see a number of the Rennie Mackintosh drawings, which we have, which we had copies of. And you can see the house, which when we started building was only the studio and the dining room on the right-hand side with a little lobby just above it. And then there was only Edward's bedroom up on the top floor. And we've now changed it, and there are 6 double bedrooms, and each with their own bathroom. So it was quite an interesting project to take. And I think Stuart has a picture of what the house looked at when I brought the bank manager around to say that I needed to borrow a little more money to complete it. I don't know whether you've got that.
No, I haven't got that. It's not in that display, Richard.
Yeah, well, it's not a very good, but there was a whacking great hole in the ground going down 2 floors. And when the bank manager, being a very good Scotsman, who became a great friend of mine, looked down, and I said, could I borrow some money from you? He said, I will reserve my thoughts for the time being. Luckily, he came up and we completed the house, and it's a lovely house to have now. Finally, Stuart, I believe, has some pictures of 1 or 2 of the paintings. This is a great painting by somebody called William Scott, who's an Irish painter. And this was, I suppose, in the early 1900s, 1904 or 5, that sort of thing. And it's a very rare one. After that, he painted a lot of sort of hanging frying pans and the odd thing. But this one really is an outstanding painting. And it was in his final collection of books they put together. It was on a double spread in the painting. So that's a very good painting to have. The next one we have, now this is by Vanessa Bell. I think it's one of the nicest paintings. Edward had it, and none of the auction houses, thank goodness, have recognized it to be a great painting. But I think it's one of her best paintings, the most wonderful color. And the pot in the middle is incredible. It almost lights up when the sun catches it during the day. The next painting is one of the few impressionists which were left over. This is Maurice Utrillo. It's an early painting of him. It's called The End of the Road. It's got wonderful colors of very faint green and brown on the roof and grey and this, that, and the other. I mean, it's a very fine painting, and luckily that still hangs in the studio. I managed to buy it back, which was great. The next one is quite interesting because it is by Duncan Grant, I hope. Now, this is quite interesting because in the background, this also is in the studio. You can see a lot of the painting of the Omega workshops, which he and Vanessa and others set up. And they painted very, very modernistic scenes and things. And sadly, it didn't financially work out, but any of those frames and paintings now are extremely well thought of. Now, the last one, Stuart has kindly, and Stuart, thank you for putting this together. You've done extremely well, and you made my job very easy. This shows the influence of the French Impressionists. This was actually painted in the Café Paris in London, but you can see the sort of 20s of the girl in the sort of black frock and the champagne and the coral necklace. And also the people dining in the background. And that was actually bombed in the war when my parents both were there, and sadly a number of people were killed, but they were lucky because their table was behind a pillar. So their life was saved, but that's what happened in the war, that sort of thing. But anyway, I think it's a fine painting, and I'm glad to have that in the studio as well. Anyway, thank you for listening to my little screed, and Stuart, I hope that's satisfactory. And there finally is a picture of the studio itself, which luckily was put back exactly as it was, and it gives us enormous pleasure, and we use it regularly as a family.
You can see there the large bay window that I showed in the drawings earlier. If people want to, I'm not sure, Robin, if anybody's asked any questions in the chat room.
I think everyone's just been absolutely rapt at that. There's not been any questions.
No questions.
Except for wondering if 78 Derngate was opening soon, but.
it's always difficult because being in the studio, it's easier to show various elements and to explain the drawings and the processes that went through there. And it must have been frustrating for Mackintosh to not have all three studios being made rather than just the one in the middle for Harold Squire. It would be very quiet. You want to ask Richard about any painting specifically, or his favourite paint? I know there were some. We tried to put some of the paintings on, and I like the sort of connections. I think the thing that I find quite fascinating is the connections of Augustus John and the Bloomsbury Group, and the intertwining of the different people. Because I think there was, the thing that I'd mentioned earlier with Epstein was that I think we didn't really explain that, was Molly, Richard's mother. Did she train under Epstein, Richard? Is that right?
She worked in his studio, and 4 or 5 of her works eventually ended up in the Royal Academy. And she had a very nice Epstein sculpture, which I suppose she bought from him, which is still in the family. I think my sister has that. So, but she worked there, and then some of her work was really quite modern for the time. And luckily, I had a lot of it recast in the 60s or 70s, and so we have quite a big collection of her works. There is also at the end of the studio, Stuart, which I think you've seen, there's a very nice marble of her sister, Gwen le Bas, who was sadly killed in the 40s, the 1939-45 war in the Guards Chapel. And she produced it, and it was in marble, so she obviously worked it through. But when she showed it to her father, he said he was not very keen on one of his girls arriving nude in the Royal Academy. So they put a stone on the finger. Instead of calling it Gwen le Bas, they called it girl with a ring. And that was in the Academy as well. And that now sits at the end of the studio.
I think the other thing I found quite fascinating when I was doing some research and also getting some pictures for Richard as part of this was coming across lovely portraits of Molly and Gwen in the National Portrait Gallery taken in 1930 by Lafayette, and they're absolutely stunning. Richard hadn't seen those pictures before, which was quite nice. So it was quite good unraveling some of those images. I think your father's, there's a picture of your great-grandfather, I think, as well. Is that right? Or your father?
My great-grandfather, absolutely. It was interesting when you mentioned that the Spanish flu hit London in a very big way, and we don't know how it affected the Mackintosh family. I know that my father, who'd been caught by the Germans on the 4th day of the war, was in a prisoner of war camp for 4 years. When he was finally let out, they all went to Holland. And he wrote every year to my grandfather, the Montague Burrows, who was a professor at Oxford. And he wrote to my grandmother, Lady Burrows, and he put on it when he was in Holland. They'd all, a lot of them had got the prisoners coming out of there who were sent to Holland firstly for a time to be checked and who they were, etc. And they all caught this wretched Spanish flu. And he said, for a week, I felt extremely weak. Having survived 4 years of the Germans in prisoner of war camps wasn't very nice, but a number of them actually were killed by this wretched Spanish flu. So it was interesting you brought that up, because I never knew until recently that he'd suffered from it.
Were you going to say something, Robin?
Well, I saw that Anne Strathy had her hand up, so I think she has a question. I can ask something.
Okay, I turned off. There was if she wants to unmute again.
Yeah, no, it was only to. The first thing was really how nice it was that the studios continued with artistic people in it and living in it and that sort of thing. But the other thing I was just going to mention is about the Ashby House and E.A. Walton being a Glasgow boy, and all those sort of networks that Joshie obviously sort of fed into when he came to Chelsea, but also that Hoppy, despite his name looking French, was actually German.
Yeah.
So that was another link, I think, with German people. And I think they felt quite sad about that when the war broke out. A lot of people at Mackintosh who lost all those contacts.
Yeah.
I think Hoppy did, I think, keep mingling with a lot of people because he was naturalised. He naturalised during the war. And a lot of them did. So it's an interesting group of people.
Because it might also be that connection, because they were also trying to unravel Bassett Locke's connection with Mackintosh, and it was some views are it was through Germany in connection. So I mean, it could have been something like Hoppy. Yeah.
Yeah. So, no, thank you very much. That was really fascinating.
Okay, no problem. Anybody else?
I was just going to ask, that was such a fascinating talk, and obviously an incredible collection. I love that you're still living in it. In fact, I just went this morning to Evelyn Silber's for coffee, who lives in a Thompson villa, and just seeing these amazing heritage spaces with like all the furniture and lived in, I think is so wonderful. And I was curious about, you've obviously been putting that collection back together. So was there inventories that the family has do after deaths and things like that? And have you just been keeping an eye out? And do you still, like, how many pieces in the end have you managed to bring back into your collection that had been gone out? And is that something you're still doing to rebuild as things pop up?
Well, that's a very interesting question, because when I had my last meeting, sadly, with Edward, I said to him, you know, what would you do if you're handing this collection over to me to really run it, etc.? He said, well, I'll tell you exactly what I'd do. I'd sell the whole thing because it was my collection, and I would buy the modern paintings, Freud, Bacon, etc., etc. And then when we started looking around his various houses, he had houses all over the place, one really fell in love with the school because he had no list. We had the list of the Royal Academy collection, but one had to go around and learn, is that by Duncan Grant, is that by whoever? And I suppose one really fell in love with the whole thing and thought what a wonderful taste he had. And so I thought, well, I'm not going to sell this. And as and when, for instance, my brother had to sell quite a lot of his paintings, and I tried to buy the whole of his collection, but sadly they went to Christie's, but I bought quite a few there. And then my mother, who lived a very, very long time, quite comfortably, but quite a substantial cost, I agreed with her that as the costs went up, I would buy her paintings, and she had some lovely paintings. She had very good taste, but part of his collection. So slowly I built up this collection, which now I suppose is 200 or 300 paintings. And every now and again, somebody rings up. The other day I was walking past a dealer's shop going to Christie's to show my son how the auction, there was a very good collection by, I think, somebody called Hunter was coming up, and I took him, he's been living in Dubai. I took him along, and as we walked down, I saw in the window a very nice Kelly, which I sadly spent rather a lot of money buying the other day. And it turns out to be the 9th painting he painted of this girl, of the first Kelly painting I fell in love with when I was being educated at school when I was about 18. And there was a print of it in one of the little restaurants there. And my secretary pointed out, I kept a list of all the paintings which I loved, and paintings by Wilson Steer, etc. And my secretary, who's been with me since she was about 15, said to me, this painting is the same painting as the first Kelly that you loved. And I was amazed that she'd done. I didn't realize it. Anyway, so every now and again, I'm afraid one weakens. And I was persuaded by a dealer to buy a lovely Henry Lamb of Edie McNeill. You may have seen Mr. Gibson, Hugh Gibson, the dealer, sold the most wonderful drawing of Edie McNeill, who was his sister-in-law. The other day, it was just a drawing by Augustus John, and it fetched an enormous amount of money. It was absolutely wonderful. So, you know, things come up. That fetched an awful lot. I wouldn't have bought that, but things come up, and I'm afraid one's still tempted. It's like taking drugs. I think you can't really get away from it, and I love it. I love being in the studio here. It's and if you're ever in London, do ring up or get Stuart to arrange, then do come and see them, because it's been a labour of love, and it gives me a great pleasure.
Thank you. Is anyone writing down your memoirs?
Well,
I
mine.
think, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, those are some amazing stories that should be captured. I'm glad this is being recorded, but that's great stuff.
It's funny you say that, Rob. I think the first time we did the talk down in Glebe Place, and Richard would come up with some stories, and then the next time I was down, he would add to the stories, so they sort of developed. And I thought, well, what's he going to bring out next? And it's, you know, it's quite. I think that aspect, it's like social history, and it's fascinating. That, I mean, it's amazing that Richard had his 21st birthday party, and you've got Douglas Grant and Augustus John and people like that that are at that party. It's quite sort of. The connections are amazing. Yeah.
We've been very lucky, I must say.
Yeah, but no, it's I always enjoy it when I go down. It's an amazing space in that area, and just the whole element. And as Anne said earlier, it's nice that connections. It's had an artist connections all the way through from Mackintosh's original designs. Although the house has undergone changes and such, but it's still nice to have all that connection. I mean, the studio is just along the road, and unfortunately, the studio has gone. I mean, the last time we were there was 2009 during the centenary for the GSA, and it's been bought. You might have seen something in the paper. It's now worth, I can't remember how many million was it that has been all turned into that part along at the end. Was it 14 million or something?
No, they've put it on the market at 9 million.
Only 9, okay.
There was another one down the road which belonged to a Russian banker, and they put it on for 9 million. And those two houses now, I think, are on the market at 6. So the price is dropping every day, Stuart, at the moment. So one of these days you might be able to buy one. So
okay, I'll save up my pennies. Yeah.
I mean, that's pocket change, Stuart.
Yeah, I know. But no, I think the area around it's fascinating, with the artist and the whole element that's lived in the past elements are fascinating in the area. But,
there's a wonderful house just opposite our house here. I went to have dinner. I shan't tell you who owns it, but I was fascinated walking in. There's an enormous bacon opposite. And then there's a wonderful David Hockney. I mean, this chap's been a great collector. Sadly, I think he's had a few problems recently with his business, but he's had wonderful taste as well. So we're very lucky to have a few neighbours who actually love painting as well, love the paintings.
yeah. You haven't been to Stuart Grimshaw's house yet, have you, Richard?
Have I what?
You haven't been to Stuart Grimshaw's house, the one that used to be Rossetti's house?
No, I'm sadly I haven't. No, but we'll arrange that. Absolutely, that would be lovely.
Okay, because he's got a big Mackintosh collection inside there.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Wow. I've said, whereabouts is that in London?
That's in Cheney
Any walk. It's
Yeah.
right round down the way.
Yeah.
Right.
That's
well,
a good trip.
well, next
Yeah, that
time.
would be a good trip. It's like going back into a time capsule when you get into that house. It's just amazing.
Right. Well, I'd love to see that. That'd be great. Very good.
Okay. Well, I'm glad you everybody enjoyed it. It's nice to see quite a few faces there. I see Liz there. How are you, Liz? Yeah. But no, it's good. So I'm glad everybody's all surviving. Yeah. But,
Absolutely.
okay.
Well,
Hi,
anybody's welcome, Stuart, to join
Yes.
us at the annual meeting. And then I always take Stuart out for dinner with two of my granddaughters, which he enjoys. Well, they enjoy enormously. So we've just had one arrive this evening. So Stuart, you're always welcome here. And anybody else wants to come and see it, please do, because it's we're very lucky to have it, and we enjoy people being able to see it as well.
Yeah. No, it's
Very
good. Okay. Thank you very much, everybody. Okay.
Right, thanks very much, Stuart.
Take care.
That's great.